Welcome to Heartfelt Revenge Stories. I'm Emma, and I'm 28 years old. My father spent nearly 3 decades telling me I was too pretty to be his daughter. He said my golden hair and crystal blue eyes were living proof of my mother's betrayal. He accused her of cheating. He treated me like I was evidence of a crime she never committed. When he demanded I take a DNA test before he'd walk me down the aisle, I finally agreed, but those results didn't just prove him wrong about the affair, they proved I wasn't his daughter, or my mother's either. What we discovered at the hospital where I was born made my father collapse in front of 60 relatives. Please subscribe and like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Now let me take you back 6 weeks to the night my father issued his ultimatum. It was a Sunday dinner at my parents' house in Fairfield, Connecticut, a massive 6-bedroom Tudor-style home that my father loved reminding us he'd earned with his own two hands. The dining room sparkled with expensive furniture and fine china that my mother polished every single week as if perfection could somehow shield her from his accusations. My grandmother, Eleanor, sat at the far end of the table. Her silver hair was pulled back elegantly, and she watched my father the way a hawk watches a snake. My brother, Marcus, who's 31 and has always been the golden child, kept his eyes fixed on his plate. My mother, Diane, gripped her linen napkin like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to earth. And then Richard Thornton cleared his throat. "I won't be attending your wedding, Emma." The words hit like a grenade exploding in the middle of our meal. My mother's fork clattered against her plate with a sharp, jarring sound. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling, "please, not tonight." But he was already reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded document and slid it across that polished oak table toward me. "I've thought about this for a very long time," he said, his voice eerily steady, almost rehearsed. "I won't walk another man's daughter down the aisle, not until we settle this once and for all." I looked at the paper. It was a consent form for a DNA paternity test from a local clinic. His name was already signed at the bottom in his precise, controlled handwriting. "You have 6 weeks," Richard continued, leaning back in his chair like he owned the world. "Take the test. Make the results public to the family. If you're mine, I'll be there. I'll even apologize." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it whatsoever. "But we both know what the test will show." My grandmother's teacup hit the saucer with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. My mother started crying, those silent tears streaming down her cheeks that I'd seen too many times. And I just sat there, staring at my father's expensive Rolex glinting under the chandelier, thinking, 28 years. He's been building to this moment for 28 years. I didn't sign the paper that night. I didn't storm out dramatically either. I simply looked him in the eyes and said, "Thank you for the reminder, Richard. I'll remember this." And oh, I meant every single word. Let me explain why that dinner didn't shock me. By 28, I've learned that my father's cruelty followed a pattern, as predictable as the tide and twice as relentless. I was 7 years old the first time I understood I was different. I'd pressed my ear against my parents' bedroom door after hearing my mother cry, and I heard him call her terrible names I didn't fully understand yet. "Look at that blonde hair. Where did it come from, Diane? Certainly not from me." At 12, I wanted to join the school volleyball team. Richard refused to sign the permission slip. He told me I'm not investing in someone else's kid. He said this right in front of Marcus, who got brand new baseball cleats that exact same week. At 18, Marcus went to Boston University. Richard paid every single cent: tuition, housing, meal plans, spending money, everything. When I got accepted to nursing school, he looked at me across that same dining table and said, "Your real father can pay for yours." So I took out loans. I worked double shifts at a diner, coming home exhausted with my feet aching. I graduated 6 years later with $60,000 in debt and a degree I'd earned without his help. But the worst part wasn't the money or the missed opportunities. The worst part was watching what his accusations did to my mother. Every argument they had, every disagreement about anything, bills, vacations, Marcus's career, somehow always circled back to me. I was his weapon, his evidence, his constant reminder of her alleged betrayal. The night before I left for college, my grandmother Eleanor pulled me aside. Her grip on my wrist was firm, urgent. "Keep every document from the hospital where you were born," she said, her eyes boring into mine. "Your birth certificate, any paperwork. I have a feeling we might need them someday." I didn't understand then, but I kept those papers, and 18 years later, I'd finally learn why she told me. That night, I drove back to my apartment in Hartford, a small one-bedroom apartment that I'd furnished with secondhand pieces and pure stubbornness. Nathan was waiting on the couch with his laptop open to floor plans for a client, a glass of wine already poured for each of us. He knew immediately something was wrong. What did he do this time? I told him about the DNA form, the ultimatum, the 6-week deadline. Nathan's jaw tightened with every single word. "Maybe you should just do it. Take the test, prove him wrong once and for all, shut him up forever." I set down my wine glass, a cheap Target find, nothing like the expensive Waterford crystal my father drank from, and looked at the modest diamond on my finger. Nathan had designed the ring himself, based on a sketch I'd drawn years ago in a journal. "It's not about proving him wrong anymore," I said quietly. "It's about freeing my mother." Nathan went completely silent. He knew the story I was about to tell. 5 years ago, I'd gotten a call from my grandmother at 2 in the morning. She'd found my mother in the bathroom with an empty bottle of sleeping pills. The paramedics arrived in time, but just barely. Since then, Diane had been on antidepressants, seeing a therapist twice a week, building herself piece by piece. Richard never apologized. He never even acknowledged what his 23 years of accusations had done to her. He just kept insisting he was right. My mother gave that man 35 years of complete loyalty, complete faithfulness, and he repaid her with 28 years of calling her a liar and a cheater. I picked up my phone and pulled up a local genetics lab I'd researched months ago. Gene Trust. Independent, certified, and most importantly, not connected to Richard. "I'll take the test," I said firmly, "but I'll do it my way." 2 weeks later, Richard turned 60. The party was held at the Fairfield Country Club, 18 holes of manicured green overlooking Long Island Sound, a private dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows, and 30 relatives gathered to celebrate the man who'd made my mother's life a living prison. I wore a simple black dress. Nathan squeezed my hand as we walked in, whispering, "2 hours. We can survive 2 hours." We couldn't. Halfway through dinner, after 3 glasses of expensive wine, Richard stood up to give a speech. He thanked everyone for coming. He praised Marcus for his brilliant career in finance. He raised a glass to my mother for her patience. Then his eyes found me across the room. "I see my daughter is here tonight," he said, and the word daughter was wrapped in invisible air quotes that everyone could hear. A few relatives chuckled uncomfortably. "I hope she's been thinking about our conversation, about proving where she really comes from." The room went completely quiet. "Dad," Marcus said, half rising from his chair, "maybe this isn't the time." Richard waved him off dismissively. No, this is exactly the time. Families should be honest with each other, shouldn't they?" He smiled at me with that cold, reptilian smile I'd seen 1,000 times before. "You know what they call a bird that lays its eggs in another bird's nest? A cuckoo. The cuckoo's egg looks beautiful, doesn't it? But it doesn't belong there. It never did." Somewhere behind me, an aunt gasped audibly. A cousin actually snickered. My mother stared at her lap, tears dripping onto her Cartier bracelet, a guilt gift Richard had given her after one of their worst fights. I picked up my fork, set it down again carefully, and stood up slowly. Every single eye in that room turned to me. "Thank you for the reminder, Richard," I said, my voice steady and clear. I'll remember this. Then I turned to my mother. Mom, would you like to step outside for some air? She took my hand, and together we walked out of that room, past the whispers, past the stares, past the man who'd spent 28 years trying to destroy us both. But I wasn't done, not even close. What I discovered next would bring my father to his knees and expose a secret that had been buried for 28 years. Stay with me for part 2. My grandmother caught up to us in the parking lot, her heels clicking against the asphalt like gunshots echoing in the night. Emma, wait! I turned around. Eleanor Whitmore was 78 years old, with posture like a queen and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She'd never liked Richard. That man thinks he's God's gift to engineering, she'd told my mother before the wedding, but he's just a small man with a big ego. Now she looked at me with something I'd never seen in her face before, pure urgency. There's something I need to tell you, she said, glancing back toward the club to make sure Richard hadn't followed. Something I should have told you years ago. She led us to a bench overlooking the golf course. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and my grandmother's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The night you were born, she said slowly, something strange happened at St. Mary's Hospital. I felt my mother stiffen beside me. When the nurse brought you out to show me, your grandfather was still alive then, we were both there. She looked absolutely terrified. Her hands were shaking. She handed you to Diane too quickly, then practically ran out of the room. Mom, Diane said, her voice cracking, you never told me this. I tried to investigate. I called the hospital, asked questions. They stonewalled me, told me everything was normal, all records sealed for privacy. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, carefully preserved. But I made a copy of your birth record before they locked everything down. I looked at the document, my heart starting to pound. Time of birth, 11:47 p.m. I gave birth at 11:58, my mother said slowly, her voice distant with memory. I remember, looking at the clock. I remember because the doctor made a joke about you almost being a leap day baby. 11 minutes. Something had happened in those 11 minutes. There's a name, my grandmother said, pointing at the faded paper. The head nurse that night, Margaret Sullivan. She retired 10 years ago. She paused. I have her address. The next morning, I walked into Gene Trust's Hartford office with 3 DNA samples carefully prepared. Mine was easy, a cheek swab sealed in a sterile tube. My mother's was voluntary. She'd given it to me the night before with tears in her eyes and steady hands. Whatever this shows, you're my daughter. Nothing changes that. My father's sample was stolen, a few strands of hair plucked from the brush he kept in the guest bathroom, the one I'd used every Thanksgiving and Christmas for years, pretending I didn't notice the way he flinched when I reached past him for the soap. The technician at Gene Trust, a calm woman named Dr. Reyes, explained the process thoroughly. Results in 3 weeks, legally admissible if needed, complete confidentiality. I paid extra for expedited processing. My grandmother insisted on covering the cost, pressing her credit card into my hand when I tried to refuse. That afternoon, I tried calling Margaret Sullivan. The phone rang 6 times before finally someone picked up. Hello? A woman's voice, older, trembling slightly. Hello, Mrs. Sullivan. My name is Emma Thornton. I was born at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1997. I believe you were the head nurse that night, and I can't help you. The words came fast, panicked, cutting me off mid-sentence. Mrs. Sullivan, please, I just need to ask. I don't know what you're talking about. Please don't contact me again. Click. I stared at my phone for a long moment, my hand shaking. Nathan looked up from his drafting table. What happened? She hung up on me. I set the phone down slowly, my mind racing. But not before she panicked, Nathan. She knows something. She definitely knows something. An innocent woman would have been confused, asked questions. Margaret Sullivan was terrified. Whatever happened that night in 1997, she'd been carrying it for 28 years, and now, so would I. 3 days later, the email arrived. Not to me directly. Richard wasn't that subtle. He sent it to our entire extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins, people I hadn't seen since childhood. 47 recipients. My mother, my grandmother, and I were all copied. The subject line read, "Regarding Emma's wedding." I read it in my car, parked outside the hospital where I worked, my hands trembling against the steering wheel. Dear family, as many of you know, I have carried a burden for 28 years. I have endured doubt about my daughter's true parentage, and I have watched my wife refuse to admit the truth. I have asked Emma to take a DNA test and share the results with our family before her wedding. She has so far refused, which I believe speaks for itself. Until this matter is resolved publicly, I will not be attending the ceremony. I hope you will all understand my position. Attached is a family photograph from Emma's christening. I invite you to look closely and draw your own conclusions. Regards, Richard Thornton. The attachment was a photo I remembered from my grandmother's mantel. Me, at 3 months old, cradled in my mother's arms. Blonde hair, blue eyes, pale skin. Surrounded by Richard, Marcus, and a dozen brunette relatives. Richard had circled my face in red marker and added a caption, "Spot the difference." Within hours, the responses started flooding in. Some defended my mother, bless them, but most just asked questions, careful, probing questions, curious about the drama unfolding in our family. Nathan called me that night, his voice tight with frustration. "Just do what Dad wants," he said tersely. "You're making this worse. You're ruining his reputation." I actually laughed at that. I couldn't help it. "His reputation?" I repeated incredulously. "That's what you're worried about?" He hung up without answering. 3 weeks after I submitted the samples, the email from Gene Trust arrived at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Nathan was traveling for work, a project consultation in Boston that couldn't be rescheduled. I was alone in my apartment, a half-eaten salad forgotten on the coffee table, my laptop open to a streaming service I hadn't actually been watching. The subject line was clinical. "Your DNA analysis results. Secure document." I entered my password with shaking fingers. I verified my identity. I opened the PDF. And then I read it 3 times, because the first 2 times, the words didn't make any sense at all. Subject A, Emma Thornton, shows 0% genetic match with Subject B, Richard Thornton. I'd expected that. I'd prepared for it, even steeled myself to the confirmation that Richard was right about one thing, even if he was wrong about everything else. But then came the second line, and my entire world tilted sideways. Subject A, Emma Thornton, shows 0% genetic match with Subject C, Diane Thornton. I stopped breathing. 0%. Not my father's daughter, not my mother's daughter either. I called Gene Trust's after-hours line immediately, my voice cracking as I demanded to speak with someone, anyone who could explain this impossible result. A technician walked me through it patiently, professionally. No contamination, no errors, no possibility of a mistake. The samples were clear and properly handled. The science is conclusive. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, my phone in my lap, staring at the ceiling until the room started to blur. For 28 years, my father called my mother a cheater. For 28 years, he was wrong about the affair. She had been faithful, just like she'd always claimed. But he was right about one thing. I wasn't his daughter. The question that kept spinning through my mind, making me dizzy with confusion, was simple and terrifying. Whose daughter was I? The answer was hidden in a hospital cover-up that lasted nearly 30 years. Part 3 will reveal the truth that made a nurse break her silence after all these years. I drove to my parents' house the next morning, timing my arrival for 10 a.m., late enough that Richard would be at his golf game, early enough that my mother would still be in her robe, drinking Earl Grey in the sunroom. She looked up when I walked in, and her face immediately creased with concern. "Emma, what's wrong? You look pale." I sat down across from her and handed her my phone with the Gene Trust report on the screen. I watched her read it. I watched the color drain completely from her face. I watched her lips move silently as she read the numbers again and again, like if she read them enough times they might change. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wild with confusion and fear. "This is wrong," she whispered desperately. "This has to be wrong." I called the lab, triple-checked everything. "There's no mistake, Mom." "But I gave birth to you." Her voice rose, cracking on the edges. "I was in labor for 14 hours. I felt you come out of my body. I saw you, Emma. You were red and screaming and mine." I took her hands in mine. They were ice cold. "I believe you," I said firmly, "which means there's only one explanation." I paused, letting it sink in. "Something happened at the hospital. Someone switched us." The silence stretched between us like a wire about to snap. "The time," my mother said suddenly, her eyes going distant. "The birth certificate says 11:47, but I remember. I was watching the clock because the contractions were so bad. You were born at 11:58. I always wondered about that discrepancy, but I thought maybe I'd remembered wrong. 11 minutes. 11 minutes that changed two families forever." "Mom," I said carefully, choosing my words, "if I'm not your biological daughter, that means your real daughter is out there somewhere." I squeezed her hands. 28 years old, living someone else's life. My mother started to cry. Not the silent tears Richard always provoked, but deep, shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal and broken. "We have to find her," she managed between sobs. "We have to find them both." I need to pause here for just a moment. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you didn't belong in your own family, like you were somehow wrong just for existing, I see you. This story isn't over. The truth is about to get so much more complicated. Richard found out about the DNA test before I could prepare. Marcus, always the obedient son, had seen the Gene Trust confirmation email on my mother's phone while visiting for lunch. Within an hour, my phone was ringing. Richard's voice was triumphant before I'd even said hello. What did it say? Was I right? I didn't answer. I couldn't figure out how to explain that he was right and wrong at the same time. My silence told him everything he needed to know. I knew it. He actually laughed, a sound of pure vindication that made my stomach turn. 28 years, Emma. 28 years I've been telling everyone, and no one believed me, but I was right. I was right all along. Richard, does your mother know? Of course she knows. She's probably crying right now, trying to figure out how to spin this. I could hear him pacing, his excitement barely contained. "I'm sending another email to everyone, this time with proof. Everyone needs to see." "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You're not my daughter. Your mother lied to me for almost 30 decades, and now everyone will know exactly what kind of woman Diane Thornton really is." He hung up before I could explain that Diane hadn't lied, that she'd been telling the truth all along, that the real story was something none of us had ever imagined. Within the hour, Richard called my mother and told her to pack her bags. "I want you out of my house by the end of the month," he said coldly. "I'm done with your lies." My grandmother drove over immediately to stay with her. When I arrived that evening, I found them both in the living room. My mother curled into the couch like a wounded animal, my grandmother standing guard like a silver-haired sentinel. "He thinks he's won," I said quietly. My grandmother looked at me with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Then let's show him the rest of the story." The next 3 days were the hardest of my life. I considered canceling the wedding, not because of Richard, but because I couldn't bear the thought of my mother's vindication being overshadowed by white tulle and champagne toasts. Nathan absolutely refused. We're getting married, period. Your father's issues are not our issues. We don't postpone our life for his tantrum. But I couldn't move forward without the truth, and the truth was locked inside Margaret Sullivan's memory. I called her again and again, 5 times in 3 days, each call going straight to voicemail. On the 6th try, I left a different message, my voice steady with determination. Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Emma Thornton. I know you remember that name. I have DNA evidence, certified, legally admissible DNA evidence that proves a baby was switched at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15th, 1997. I'm not looking to blame you. I'm not looking to sue anyone. I just need to know who I am. I paused, steadying my breath. If you don't call me back, my next call will be to a lawyer. I'll subpoena the hospital records, I'll file a formal investigation, and whatever you've been hiding for 28 years will come out in the worst possible way. I waited. 1 hour. 2 hours. At 4:17 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Thursday, 2 p.m., Riverside Diner, Bridgeport. Come alone. I stared at the message for a long time, my heart pounding. Then I texted back, I'll be there. Whatever Margaret Sullivan had been carrying for 28 years, she was finally ready to let it go. The question was I ready to hear it? Riverside Diner was the kind of place time forgot. Vinyl booths patched with duct tape, a jukebox that only played oldies, and coffee that had probably been brewing since the Reagan administration. Margaret Sullivan sat in the corner booth, her back to the wall. She was 72, smaller than I'd imagined, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and hands that trembled against her coffee cup. She looked up when I slid into the seat across from her. You look just like her, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Linda, your biological mother. Same hair, same eyes. I felt my heart stutter in my chest. You know who my biological mother is? Margaret closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, they were wet with unshed tears. I've carried this for 28 years, she said, her voice breaking. Every single day, wondering if I did the right thing by staying quiet, wondering if I should have spoken up when it happened. She reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. This is my shift log for March 15th, 1997, the night you were born. She opened it to a flagged page and slid it across the table with trembling fingers. I read her cramped handwriting, my blood running cold with every single line. 11:47 p.m., baby girl number 1 born to Diane Thornton, healthy, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. 12:58 p.m., baby girl number 2 born to Linda Morrison, healthy, 6 pounds, 4 ounces. 12:32 a.m., incident. Trainee nurse Carla Harris mixed up infants after bathing, realized error at 2:15 a.m. Both families had already bonded. 2:45 a.m., meeting with hospital administrator. Decision made to correct records, not families. Less traumatic for everyone. NDA required for all staff present. I looked up at Margaret, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the journal. They knew, I whispered, my voice cracking. They knew that night, and they covered it up. The administrator said it would cause more harm to switch you back. Both mothers had already held their babies, fed them, named them. I was 24 years old. They threatened my license, my pension. They made me sign a non-disclosure agreement. I had 2 kids of my own to feed. Who was the other baby? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The one who went home with Linda Morrison. Margaret pulled out another piece of paper, a printout from a social media profile. A woman my age, brown hair, brown eyes, a smile that looked exactly like Marcus's. Her name is Rachel Morrison, Shed said, quietly. She's 28 years old. She lives in Springfield, Massachusetts. She looked at me with eyes full of decades of guilt. and she's your biological mother's daughter. Everything I thought I knew about my identity was a lie. In part 4, I'll tell you what happened when I finally met my biological family and when Richard saw the daughter he should have raised. That night, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open to Rachel Morrison's LinkedIn profile, staring at her face like it might disappear if I looked away. Elementary school teacher at Springfield Public Schools, graduate of UMass Amherst, volunteer at the local animal shelter. Her profile picture showed a woman with chestnut brown hair and warm brown eyes, standing in front of a classroom decorated with colorful alphabet letters. She looked exactly like what my brother Marcus might have looked like if he'd been born a woman. I composed the message 17 times before finally hitting send, my finger hovering over the button for what felt like an eternity. Hi, Rachel. This is going to sound completely insane, and I apologize in advance. My name is Emma Thornton. I was born at St. Mary's Hospital in Bridgeport, Connecticut on March 15, 1997, the same night and place as you. I recently did a DNA test that showed I'm not biologically related to either of my parents. I've since spoken with a nurse who was working that night, and she confirmed that 2 babies were accidentally switched. I believe you're the biological daughter of Diane and Richard Thornton, and I believe I'm the biological daughter of Linda Morrison. I have documentation. I have a witness statement. I'm not looking for anything from you. I just thought you deserved to know the truth. If you're willing to talk, please call me. I included my phone number and closed the laptop before I could second-guess myself for the 18th time. 24 hours passed. I checked my phone every 10 minutes like a teenager waiting for a text back from a crush, my anxiety building with each passing hour. Then, at 9:38 p.m. the following night, my phone rang, the sudden sound making me jump. "Is this Emma?" The voice on the other end was shaky, uncertain, but something in it felt strangely familiar. "Rachel?" A long pause, a shuddering breath. "My whole life," she said, her voice breaking. "People have told me I don't look like my parents. My dad, well, my legal dad, used to joke that maybe the hospital made a mistake. We all laughed about it." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I guess it wasn't a joke after all. We talked for 3 hours that night. By the end, we both agreed to take another DNA test, this one comparing Rachel to Richard and Diane. The results would be ready in 10 days, just in time for my engagement party. Over the next week, I built my case like a prosecutor preparing for the trial of her life. First, the documents. I had my original Gene Trust report showing 0% match with both Richard and Diane. I had Margaret Sullivan's handwritten shift log from 1997, which she'd finally agreed to let me photograph. I had a notarized statement from Margaret signed before a witness at her attorney's office. "Her own decision," she'd said when I picked up the document, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "The hospital threatened me for 28 years. I'm 72 now. What are they going to do? Fire me from retirement?" Second, the DNA. Rachel had submitted her samples to Gene Trust using the same expedited process I had. Her results comparing to Richard and Diane would arrive 2 days before the engagement party. Third, the witnesses. My grandmother Eleanor would be there, of course. She'd been waiting 28 years for this moment. Margaret Sullivan agreed to attend, sitting quietly in the corner until needed. And Rachel, my biological sister in spirit if not in genetics, would be waiting in the room next door. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Nathan asked as we reviewed the plan together one more time. Confronting him publicly, there's no taking it back. I thought about my mother, about the bottle of sleeping pills, about 28 years of being called a liar and a cheater. "He wanted a public reckoning," I said, my voice hard with determination. "He sent that email to 47 people. He called me a cuckoo's egg in front of the entire family." I straightened the stack of documents on my desk with steady hands. "He doesn't get to slink away privately now. Everyone who believed him needs to see the truth." Nathan nodded slowly, pride shining in his eyes. Then let's give them a show they'll never forget. 3 days before the engagement party, Rachel's DNA results arrived in my inbox. I opened them with shaking hands. Subject A, Rachel Morrison, shows 99.97% genetic match with Subject B, Richard Thornton. Subject A, Rachel Morrison, shows 99.98% genetic match with Subject C, Diane Thornton. I read the numbers 3 times, tears streaming down my face, before I could fully process what they meant. Then I called Rachel immediately. "Can you meet me tomorrow, in person?" We chose a Starbucks halfway between Hartford and Springfield, neutral ground for 2 women whose entire lives had just been rewritten by science. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 untouched lattes growing cold. When she saw me, she stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped over. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. She had brown hair, brown eyes, a strong jawline that I'd seen on Marcus 1,000 times, a subtle dimple on her left cheek that was exactly like Richard's. And I had blonde hair, blue eyes, a button nose, and fair skin that matched the photos Margaret had shown me of Linda Morrison. We were strangers who should have been sisters, sisters who were raised by the wrong families. "This is so weird," Rachel whispered, her voice cracking. Then she laughed, and I laughed, and suddenly we were hugging in the middle of a Starbucks, crying into each other's shoulders while the baristas pretended not to notice. "I want to meet them," Rachel said when we finally pulled apart, wiping her eyes. My biological parents." "You will," I promised, squeezing her hands. "In 3 days." I didn't tell her that one of those parents would be on his knees when she walked into the room. The engagement party was held at Whitmore Estate, my grandmother's family home, a Georgian manor with rose gardens and fairy lights strung through century-old oak trees. "To give you a proper celebration," my grandmother had insisted, "in a place where Richard's ego can't reach." 60 guests arrived that evening in cocktail attire, aunts and uncles, cousins, family friends, and every single person who'd received Richard's accusatory email. I wore a navy blue dress and carried myself like a woman who had already won. Nathan stayed close, his hand on the small of my back, steady as always. My mother arrived with my grandmother. Her eyes were still red from days of crying, but her posture was straighter than I'd seen in years. Something had shifted in her since we'd learned the truth, a weight lifting even before the public vindication. And then Richard arrived. He came late, of course, fashionably late, as he'd call it, letting the crowd gather, letting the anticipation build. He wore an expensive Tom Ford suit, his Rolex catching the chandelier light, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He thought this was his victory lap. He had absolutely no idea. I watched him work the room, shaking hands, accepting congratulations from relatives who believed his version of events. "Such a difficult situation," I heard an aunt murmur to him sympathetically. "You've been so patient." Marcus stood beside him, uncomfortable but compliant, the loyal soldier he'd always been. In the corner of the room, Margaret Sullivan sat quietly with a glass of water, her hands still trembling after all these years. And in the room next door, through a door that connected to the main hall, Rachel Morrison waited nervously for her cue. I checked my phone. Nathan nodded at me encouragingly. It was time. Halfway through the cocktail hour, Richard asked for a microphone. The room quieted as he stepped onto the small raised platform my grandmother had set up for toasts. He cleared his throat importantly, adjusted his jacket, and smiled at the crowd like a king addressing his subjects. "First, I'd like to congratulate Nathan," he began smoothly. "You're a brave man marrying into this complicated family." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. "But I think we all know why I'm really up here." Richard's gaze found me in the crowd, and something cold and triumphant flickered in his eyes. "There's been a lot of talk lately, a lot of speculation. I asked Emma to take a DNA test, and I know she did.
What I don't know is why she's been hiding the results." The room went completely silent. So I thought I'd help her out. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper with theatrical slowness. My son was kind enough to share a copy of the report with me. Marcus had the decency to look ashamed at least. Richard unfolded the paper slowly, savoring the moment. 0% genetic match with Richard Thornton. 0% genetic match with Diane Thornton. Gasps echoed through the room like waves. My mother gripped Eleanor's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. 28 years. Richard's voice rose with vindicated fury. 28 years I've been telling everyone that something was not right, and now the science proves it. He turned to my mother, his face contorted with decades of accumulated resentment and rage. "You lied to me, Diane. You lied to everyone. And now the whole family knows exactly what kind of woman you really are." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. And then I started walking towards the stage, my heels clicking deliberately on the hardwood floor. In the final part, you'll see Richard fall to his knees when he learns the truth, and you'll find out what happened when I finally met my real mother. Don't miss the conclusion.
You're right, Richard. My voice was calm as I stepped onto the platform and took the microphone from his hand. He was so surprised, he just let me take it. The DNA test shows I'm not your biological daughter, and I'm not Mom's biological daughter either. Richard's smirk widened. A few relatives exchanged knowing glances, but not because Mom had an affair. The smirk faltered. I turned to face the crowd, all 60 of them. Every person who'd received that email, every relative who'd whispered about my mother for years. "Let me introduce you to someone." I nodded toward the side door. Rachel stepped through, 28 years old, brown hair, brown eyes, a jawline that was unmistakably, undeniably Thornton. The room erupted in murmurs. Someone dropped a champagne glass and it shattered on the floor. Marcus made a strangled sound. "This is Rachel Morrison," I said clearly. "She was born 11 minutes before me at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1997. The night I was born, there was an accident. A trainee nurse mixed up 2 babies after bathing them, and the hospital covered it up to avoid a lawsuit." I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. The wall-mounted display I'd arranged earlier flickered to life, showing the Gene Trust reports in clear, undeniable detail. Rachel's DNA shows a 99.97% match with Richard Thornton, a 99.98% match with Diane Thornton. I let that sink in, watching faces change around the room. "She is your biological daughter, Richard, the daughter you've been searching for, and she's been living in Massachusetts her entire life because a hospital made a mistake and chose to hide it." Richard's face had gone completely white. He looked at Rachel, this stranger with his jawline, his eyes, his blood, and something in him completely shattered. He looked at the DNA results on the screen, the numbers that proved him right about my parentage but catastrophically wrong about everything else. He looked at Margaret Sullivan, whose trembling testimony had just demolished 28 years of accusations. And then his knees buckled. Richard Thornton, proud, arrogant, certain Richard Thornton, collapsed onto the platform like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He caught himself on one knee, his hands slapping against the hardwood floor, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. "I didn't know," he whispered hoarsely. "How could I have known? How?" "You could have trusted her," I said, my voice quiet but carrying through the silent room. "You could have investigated. You could have looked for other explanations instead of assuming the worst about the woman who loved you." "But the hair, the eyes." "Genetics are complicated. Recessive genes exist. Hospital mistakes happen." I stepped closer, looking down at the man who had made my childhood a battlefield.
But you chose suspicion. You chose cruelty. For 28 years, you punished Mom and I for a crime that never happened. From across the room, I heard a chair scrape back. Marcus, silent, compliant Marcus, stood up. For a moment, I thought he would come to his father's defense like he always had. Instead, he walked past Richard without a glance and crossed to our mother's side, his face wet with tears. "Mom," his voice cracked completely. "I'm sorry. I should have said something years ago. I should have—" Diane pulled him into a hug, her tears soaking into his shoulder, and Richard remained on his knees, watching his family choose each other over him. For 28 years, my mother had lived in Richard Thornton's shadow. She had endured his accusations at breakfast and dinner and every moment in between. She had swallowed his cruelty like medicine, telling herself that maybe someday he would see the truth. Now, the truth was everywhere, on screens, in documents, in the face of a stranger who carried her blood. Diane stepped forward slowly, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The crowd parted for her. Even Marcus stepped aside. She stopped in front of Richard, who was still on one knee, his face wet with tears I'd never seen him cry before. 28 years, Richard. Her voice was steady, stronger than I'd ever heard it. 28 years I stayed because I loved you, because I believed that someday you would trust me, because I thought our family was worth fighting for. Richard looked up at her, his face broken. "Diane, She raised her hand, cutting him off firmly. "Not yet. You don't get to apologize yet." The room held its collective breath. "You owe me an apology in front of every person who received that email. You owe Emma an apology for every birthday you ruined, every graduation you ignored, every moment you made her feel like she didn't belong in her own family." She gestured toward Rachel, who stood frozen near the door. "And you owe Rachel an apology for being the father she deserved but never had." Richard's shoulders shook with sobs I hadn't known he was capable of. "I didn't need the world to believe me, Richard." My mother's voice cracked on the last word. "I needed you to believe me, and you never did." She turned her back on him and walked to where Rachel stood, tears streaming down both their faces. "Hello," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm your mother. I'm so sorry it took so long to find you." It took Richard 3 attempts to stand. Marcus didn't help him. Neither did I. Neither did anyone in that room full of relatives who had, until 10 minutes ago, believed his version of events. He gripped the edge of the platform, pulled himself upright, and reached for the microphone I'd set down. His voice, when he spoke, was barely recognizable, hoarse, broken, stripped of every ounce of the arrogance I'd known my entire life. "I was wrong."
3 words, 28 years overdue. I was wrong about Diane. She never— His voice cracked. He tried again. "She never betrayed me. I accused her for nearly 3 decades, and I was wrong." He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something other than suspicion in his eyes. I saw shame, I saw regret, I saw recognition of the damage he'd caused. "Emma, I took things from you that I can never give back. Your childhood, your trust, money that should have been yours." He swallowed hard. "I'll repay your student loans, all of them. It's not enough, but it's a start." Then he turned to Rachel, this stranger who was his daughter, this woman he'd never held, never known, never had the chance to disappoint. "I don't know what to say to you. You're my daughter, and I've missed everything. Your first steps, your graduations, your entire life." His voice shattered completely on the words. "That's something I'll regret until the day I die." Rachel was crying too. We all were at this point.
but her voice was remarkably steady. "We can start now," she said carefully, "if you're willing to actually be a father instead of a judge." Richard nodded, unable to speak through his tears. My grandmother stepped forward and handed him a tissue from her purse. "Clean yourself up, Richard," she said, not unkindly. "You have a lot of work ahead of you." 1 week after the engagement party, I drove to Springfield, Massachusetts, my heart pounding the entire way. The house was a modest colonial in a quiet suburb, white siding, blue shutters, a garden of wildflowers that had clearly been someone's labor of love. It was a far cry from my grandmother's estate or Richard's mansion, but warm in a way those houses had never quite managed. Linda Morrison answered the door before I could knock, like she'd been waiting by the window. She was 56 years old, with blonde hair streaked with silver and blue eyes that were an exact mirror of my own. Looking at her was like looking into a time machine. This was who I would become in 30 years. "Emma," her voice caught on my name, thick with emotion. "I've been staring at your picture all week. I kept thinking I was dreaming." She pulled me into a hug that smelled like lavender and something else I couldn't identify, something that felt impossibly like home. We sat in her kitchen for 4 hours. She showed me photographs of her childhood, of my biological grandparents who had passed away years ago, of the life I might have had if a trainee nurse hadn't made a mistake. She told me about her ex-husband, David, my biological father, who had died of cancer 3 years ago, never knowing that Rachel wasn't his. "He used to joke that Rachel had old soul eyes," Linda said, wiping her tears with a kitchen towel, her voice breaking. "Now I understand. They were your eyes, Emma. They were always your eyes." I showed her pictures of my childhood too, the blonde baby in a house full of brunettes, the girl who never quite fit, the woman who had finally found out why. "I don't want to replace Diane," Linda said gently. "She raised you. She's your mother." "She is," I agreed firmly, "but maybe there's room for one more." Linda's smile could have lit the entire house. "I'd like that," she said, squeezing my hands. "I'd like that very much." 2 months later, I married Nathan Miller in the rose garden of Whitmore Estate, surrounded by fairy lights and family, both the one I was born into and the one I was raised by. My mother walked me down the aisle, not Richard. My mother. She wore a champagne-colored dress and held her head high, her steps steady for the first time in decades. Beside her, I wore a beautiful gown that she and my grandmother had insisted on buying for me. "A proper wedding dress for a proper wedding," Eleanor had declared with satisfaction. Richard sat in the second row, quiet and diminished. He didn't protest when I told him he wouldn't be walking me down the aisle. He didn't argue when I explained that this was my mother's moment, not his. He just nodded and said quietly, "I understand." It was a start.
Rachel stood with my bridesmaids, wearing a deep green dress that brought out the brown in her eyes. Our mother's eyes. Richard's eyes. She'd met the Thorntons properly in the weeks after the party. Tentative lunches and careful conversations that were slowly building towards something like a relationship. Linda Morrison sat in the front row of the guest section, a place of honor. She waved when she caught my eye, her own eyes shining with tears of joy. My grandmother rose to give a toast, her voice ringing clear and strong. "This wedding is not just about 2 people," Eleanor said, raising her champagne glass. "It's about 2 families finally finding their way back to the truth. It's about a daughter who refused to accept a lie and a mother who waited 28 years to be believed." She looked at me, then at Rachel, then at Diane with immense pride. "To truth," she said, "however long it takes." "To truth," the room echoed, and I drank to that with everything in me. The lawsuit took 8 months. Rachel and I filed jointly against St. Mary's Hospital, represented by a medical malpractice attorney my grandmother had found, a woman who specialized in wrongful birth cases and had, she told us with a thin smile, a particular interest in institutions that think they can cover up their mistakes.
Margaret Sullivan testified, her notarized statement backed by the original shift log she'd kept hidden for 28 years. The hospital's lawyers tried to discredit her, citing her age, her NDA, her delayed disclosure. It didn't work. Internal documents surfaced during discovery, emails between hospital administrators discussing the incident, memos about risk mitigation, a budget line item labeled potential liability settlement that had been quietly renewed every year since 1997. They'd known. They'd always known. And they'd spent nearly 3 decades praying no one would find out. In the end, the hospital chose to settle rather than face a jury. $450,000 to each family, a total of $900,000, a public apology printed in the local paper, mandatory improvements to their newborn identification protocols, and the resignation of the administrator who had ordered the cover-up, long since retired, but now publicly named. "We didn't sue for revenge," I told the reporter who showed up at the courthouse steps. "We sued so no other family would spend 28 years living a lie that a hospital could have corrected in one day." Margaret Sullivan was granted immunity from any personal liability in exchange for her cooperation. She sent me a card afterward, her handwriting shaky but heartfelt. "Thank you for giving me a reason to finally tell the truth. I can sleep now." I kept it in a drawer with my birth certificate, the real one, the one that said 11:58 p.m., the one that told the truth. 6 months after the wedding, Richard invited me to dinner, just the two of us. He'd chosen a quiet Italian restaurant in downtown Hartford, not the country club, not anywhere flashy, just a corner booth with checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles. He looked older than he had at my engagement party, grayer, smaller somehow, as if the weight of his confession had physically diminished him. "I wanted to thank you," he said after we'd ordered, his voice humble, "for agreeing to see me. I never was my biological father," I said honestly. "You never were, but you did raise me, even if you did it badly." He flinched at that, but nodded, accepting it. "I'm in therapy now," he said quietly. "Diane insisted. Well, suggested strongly." He attempted a small smile. "We're doing couples counseling too. We've been separated, but we're trying to find out if there's anything left to save." I thought about my mother, about the way she'd stood in front of him at the party, demanding the apology she'd deserved for decades, about the strength it must have taken to consider rebuilding after everything he'd put her through. "I remember when you taught me to ride a bike," I said softly. "I was 5, before you decided I wasn't yours. You held the seat and ran beside me for an hour until I got it." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "I remember," he whispered. "That's the father I needed," I said steadily. "The one who held on." I paused, choosing my words carefully.
"I'm willing to try, Richard, but I need you to understand, forgiveness is a process, not an event, and you have a lot of work to do." He nodded, wiping his eyes. "I know," he said sincerely, "and I'll do it, however long it takes." I didn't forgive him that night. I'm not sure I've fully forgiven him yet, but I chose to give him the chance my mother never got, the chance to prove he could change. Rachel and Marcus met properly for the first time at a family dinner a month after the wedding. It was awkward at first. How do you make small talk with the sibling you should have grown up with, the brother who got the childhood that should have been yours? But then Marcus mentioned he was allergic to shellfish. "Wait," Rachel said, her eyes widening. "Me too, since birth. The doctor said it was genetic." "What about being left-handed?" Marcus asked, leaning forward. Rachel held up her left hand with a huge smile. "No way," Marcus laughed, a real laugh, surprised and delighted. "What about music? What bands do you listen to?" 30 minutes later, they discovered they both loved an obscure indie folk band that nobody else in either family had ever heard of. Both hated cilantro with an inexplicable passion, and both had a habit of tapping their right foot when they were thinking.
"This is so weird," Marcus said, shaking his head in wonder. "You're like a mirror, but, a girl version." "I was going to say shorter," Rachel teased. She threw a bread roll at him, and for the first time in my memory, a Thornton family dinner had genuine laughter, not the polite, strained kind that my mother had always worked so hard to manufacture, but real laughter, the kind that comes from people who are actually happy to be together. It was a small moment, but it felt like the beginning of something beautiful. 3 months after the wedding, Diane and Linda met for lunch. I wasn't there, but my mother told me about it afterward, her voice soft with wonder. They'd chosen a cafe halfway between their houses, neutral ground, as Rachel and I had done months earlier. Linda had brought photos of Rachel's childhood. Diane had brought photos of mine. They'd sat there for 3 hours, trading stories about daughters they'd raised but hadn't birthed. "She told me about Rachel's first words," Diane said, her eyes distant with emotion. "And I told her about yours. We both cried so much." "Was it strange?" I asked gently, "meeting the woman who raised your biological daughter?" My mother considered the question for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "I thought it would be," she admitted. "I thought I'd feel, I don't know, jealous, resentful maybe. But when I looked at her, all I could think was she loved Rachel the same way I loved you, completely, without question." She reached across the table and took my hand in hers. "We lost 28 years, she said, her voice cracking. "But we gained each other, and we gained the truth. That has to count for something." Linda and Diane have lunch together once a month now. They've become genuine friends, an unlikely friendship born from shared loss and unexpected connection. They call each other the other mother, and in a strange way, I think it's helped them both heal. I'm sitting in our new apartment now, a 2-bedroom in a nicer part of Hartford, with room for Nathan's home office and space for the nursery we'll need soon. The walls are covered with photographs, my wedding day with my mother on one side and Linda Morrison on the other, Rachel and me at Thanksgiving, our first holiday together, my grandmother Eleanor looking triumphant at her birthday party last month. Nathan is in the kitchen making dinner, something complicated with too many ingredients. He's been on a cooking kick lately, and it makes me smile. I've been thinking a lot about the past year, about identity and family, and what it really means to belong. For 28 years, I tried to prove I was a Thornton. I straightened my blonde hair to look darker. I learned to golf because Richard loved golf. I studied nursing instead of art because it was practical, reliable, not something a cuckoo's egg would choose. I spent my whole life trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. Now I know I was never supposed to fit. I was someone else's daughter, living someone else's life, carrying someone else's DNA. But here's what I've learned, and I need you to really hear this. DNA doesn't make a family. Love does. The woman who held my hand during nightmares, who taught me to read, who stayed married to a man who tortured her just to keep our family together, that's my mother. Not biology, love. Tell me in the comments, do you think I made the right choice giving Richard a second chance? And if you've dealt with something similar, please share your story. You're not alone in this. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life, because everyone deserves to know their truth. Nathan walks in with 2 plates and that knowing smile I love so much. You're doing that thing again, the deep thinking while staring at nothing thing. I laugh and take the plate he offers, my heart full. On the coffee table, tucked between a stack of baby name books and a pregnancy journal, is the test I took this morning. Positive. I don't know whose DNA this baby will carry. Mine? Nathan's? Some echo of the Morrisons or the Thorntons? But I know one thing with absolute certainty. This child will know they're loved from the very first moment, without condition, without doubt. That's the only proof that matters. If you're watching this and you've ever been accused of something you didn't do by a parent, a partner, anyone who should have trusted you, I want you to know that the truth has a way of surfacing. Sometimes it takes 28 years. Sometimes it takes a DNA test and a brave nurse with a guilty conscience. But it surfaces. Don't let anyone's suspicion define your worth.
And if you're the one doing the accusing, ask yourself, is my certainty worth destroying the people I love? My father spent 28 years being certain. He was certain my mother cheated. He was certain I wasn't his. He was certain his cruelty was justified. He was wrong about all of it. Trust is a choice. Doubt is easy. But 28 years of doubt can destroy a family. 28 years of trust could have saved mine. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, trust the truth even when it's hard to find.